Whenever the government interferes with the economy, a disaster awaits. This is in part due to the very nature of the government, coercion as opposed to voluntary action, the latter being the nature of the market, and in part due to the fact that the lawmakers are ignorant of economics as a science. What is further, political convenience and economic reality often clash, and in such cases, what is politically convenient is always given priority. But the laws of science and reality do not care what is political or even popular, but carry on with the inevitability of a train moving along its preset rails. The time is mid-70s. The place is the United States of America. The scene is a long, never-ending queue for petrol. I say petrol, you say petrol, agreed. People had to wait for hours at the pumps just to get a gallon of petrol. Petrol pump lines wrapped around several blocks. Some pumps posted flags, green if fuel was available, red if not. The notion that Americans were going to run out of gas was both new and completely terrifying. Jacobs tells Washington Post, "It came on so suddenly." By February 1974, according to the Baltimore Sun, drivers in Maryland found themselves waiting in 5-mile lines. Some stations illegally sold to regular customers only, while others let nurses and doctors jump the queue. Fights broke out, and some pump owners began carrying guns for self-protection. People were occasionally shot for stealing petrol from the pumps. People frequently found themselves spending whole days waiting in queue and driving around looking for petrol, only to find themselves unable to even replenish the fuel they burnt doing so. What is further, the old market system of supplying oil products never exhibited such problems. So what was going on? To make any sense of this, we first need to talk oil, and second, politics. By 1969, American domestic output of oil was peaking and could not keep pace with the increasing demand from vehicles. The US was importing 350 million barrels, or 56 cubic meters, per year by the late 1950s, mostly from Venezuela and Canada. Because of transportation costs and tariffs, it never purchased much from Middle East. By 1973, the US production has declined to 16% of the global output. In 1970, American oil production peaked, and the United States began to import more and more oil as oil imports rose by 52% between 1969 and 1972. By 1972, 83% of the American oil imports came from the Middle East. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, was founded by 5 oil-producing countries at a Baghdad conference on September 14, 1960. The 5 founding members of OPEC were Venezuela, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Kuwait. In the early 1960s, Libya, Indonesia, and Qatar joined OPEC. Like all cartels, it aimed to restrict output to push up prices to monopoly levels. In October 1973, the OPEC raised the price of crude oil by 70%. That move, together with the embargo on the US, was part of Arab countries' response to the start of the Yom Kippur War, a weeks-long conflict that pitted Egypt and Syria against Israel. But it also reflected simmering tensions between OPEC and US oil companies. At the time, as mentioned elsewhere in the video, the United States imported roughly half of its domestic oil consumption, and the Congress felt that domestic oil producers should not be able to profit from the increase in the price of oil. Consequently, they hatched a bizarre plan to hold down the price of petroleum products, chiefly petrol. Two-tiered oil pricing. The first policy adopted by the Congress was known as two-tiered oil pricing, or old oil, new oil. Under this plan, new oil, chiefly imported foreign oil, would sell for whatever the ongoing market price was, around $12 a barrel at a time. But old domestic oil, oil produced from wells that were in place before 1974, would sell for its old pre-embargo price of around $4 a barrel. The misguided idea was that the price of oil would average to about $8 a barrel, and this would help keep the price of petrol down. Of course, the whole plan falls apart once you realize how a firm's supply response is determined. A firm's supply is determined by its marginal cost. Roughly speaking, this is the extra cost one more unit of output, the last unit of output, imposes on the firm. Couple this with the fact that a firm's price and output are determined by where the demand and supply curves meet, and you have all the economic theory you need to know to understand why this scheme would not work. Now, what would you do if you were a refiner? Obviously, you would use up cheap domestic oil first. Only once you have exhausted the entire amount of cheap domestic oil will you turn to the more expensive, new, chiefly imported oil. Thus, the marginal cost, and hence the supply of a refiner, would start low, at $4 a barrel, and then take a jump where the supply of oil was exhausted, and would now be determined by $12 a barrel oil. Before that jump, it is the price of old oil that is relevant in determining the petrol prices, but after the jump, the price is entirely determined by expensive new oil. Couple this with the fact that the domestic supply of oil was only enough to meet half the US production needs, and you realize what the final price of petrol will be. The demand curve cuts the supply curve after the jump, and hence the price of petrol is completely determined by the price of expensive new oil, the same as it would be without this strange pricing scheme. So this was at best an exercise in futility. It was in effect simply a transfer from domestic oil producers to domestic refiners. The domestic oil producer got $4 for a barrel of oil it could otherwise sell for 12, and the profits they would have gotten simply went to the domestic oil refiner. It had no effect on the supply of petrol, and thus no effect on its price. Price controls. And so the two-tiered system was unsuccessful. The economic arguments did not take long to make themselves seen. Thus, the Department of Energy soon decided upon a system of price controls. The refiners were required to set a price that reflected the costs of production, that is, chiefly the price of oil. Thus, if a refiner chiefly used cheap domestic oil, its prices had to be cheaper, and so on. But the availability of cheap domestic oil varied by location. In oil-producing states such as Texas, the refiners could easily secure vast supplies of cheap domestic oil. In other regions, such as New England, virtually all oil was imported, and this meant higher petrol prices. Now, especially in geographically close locations, when you have two different prices for the same good, a process called arbitrage kicks in. This means that people, motivated by the higher price of the good in another region, will transport that good to be sold in the higher price region. But this means a higher supply of that good in the second region and a lower supply in the former place where the good used to be cheap. And generally, the greater that something is supplied, the cheaper its price would be, and vice versa. Thus, the price of the good in the formerly expensive region would fall, and its price in the formerly cheap region would rise. This process will continue until prices are equalized in both places. In this case, arbitrageurs would transport petrol from a cheap region such as Texas to the more expensive areas such as New England. If this process were allowed to continue, the price of petrol would become uniform in all states and regions barring costs of transportation. In particular, all markets would be in equilibrium and there would be no shortage of petrol. But the Department of Energy found this undesirable for some reason and decided to intervene. Thus, the shipping of petrol across regions was stopped. The result was the famous petrol shortages of the mid-70s. Periodically, the supply of petrol would entirely dry up, and there would be little, if anything, available at any price. The free market system of supplying petroleum products never exhibited such problems. The shortages were entirely due to the two-tiered pricing system coupled with the price controls and a prohibition of transportation. The entitlement program. Of course, the economists pointed this out at the time, but they were chiefly ignored as economists usually are. What did have effect was lobbying by refiners. Much of the domestic oil was sold on long-term contracts, and some refiners were able to obtain lots of it, while others could get none. Naturally, they objected that this was unfair, and the system was scrapped. What came next was known as the entitlement program. It went something like this. Each time a refiner used expensive new oil, it became entitled to a certain amount of cheap domestic oil. The amount a refiner was actually entitled to differed depending on conditions, but let us assume it was 1-for-1. Thus, for each barrel of expensive new oil you got, you would get a barrel of cheap domestic oil. This meant that marginally, the price of oil indeed did become an average of the two prices. Thus, if the price of a barrel of foreign oil was $12 a barrel, and that of domestic oil was $4, the whole thing evened out to $8 a barrel. This indeed did affect the refiner's marginal cost. The price of petrol was indeed reduced, but let us take a minute to see who was paying the difference. The American oil producer. The whole system was subsidizing foreign oil producers at the cost of the American manufacturers. This becomes clear once you think about it. The United States was buying expensive foreign oil at $12 a barrel and pretending it only cost $8. On the other hand, the domestic producers were forced to sell their oil below the world market price. Thus, US was subsidizing foreign oil and the domestic producers were the ones paying the price. Eventually, the whole thing was scrapped and replaced by a tax on domestic production of oil. But here's the problem with the tax. It imposes a disproportionate cost on the society as a whole. A tax increases the price the consumers have to pay and reduces the price the producers receive. But what is most important, it discourages production and exchange. What is further, the loss due to the reduction in output is even more than what the government gains from it. This is what we call the deadweight loss of a tax. But apparently, the increase in the price of petrol and the reduction in production was deemed acceptable by the Congress at the time. Per the US State Department, apparent progress in the negotiations between Israel and Syria convinced OPEC to lift the embargo in March 1974. But the Iranian Revolution sparked a new oil shock 5 years later in 1974. Queues, panic buying, and rationing returned. Thanks for watching this video until the end. Feel free to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this.